In this video, I'm going to talk about dimensioning rules and how to properly apply those dimensioning rules in AutoCAD. Now, what I'm actually going to discuss is the text height of your dimensions. Now, I'm using a standard class title block, so the text height is actually predefined when we created the template in the dimension style. Okay, so under the text tab, you can see that my text height is set at 0.125. Okay, I just want to clear that up right from the start. Now, you can dimension in model space, you can dimension in paper space, you can dimension with an annotative scale, you can dimension through a floating viewport. There are several ways to apply dimensions in AutoCAD. Now, the way that I generally teach in this class is I prefer to dimension in paper space, but the truth is there's several different ways to dimension. Now, if I provide a video for you asking you to dimension a certain way, please do it that way. But what really matters is how the object, the dimension values print, okay? And this is something else that can be done in different ways, but generally, well, completely throughout the program, I always teach to do your object construction in model space, and then we'll print from your layout tab or paper space. Now some companies, I've actually worked somewhere that actually had their title block in model space with the objects, okay? But I think more often than not, you'll find that if you use AutoCAD at your job, you will do your object construction in model space and print from paper space. Okay. Now this particular object, I decided that the viewport scale is 2:1. Okay. In other words, this object will print twice as large as what it's actually constructed. Okay. So I drew my object full scale in model space like normal, and the object's bottom line has a length of 2. So if I were to print this out with a viewport scale of 2:1, that means that the bottom line of this object will print out at 4 inches, because this is an imperial measurement inch title block that was created. Okay, how does that affect your dimensions? All right, and this is what we're going to explore a little bit in this video. So you can apply dimensions in model space. All right, so let's do that. Let's apply a dimension, a linear dimension for this line in model space. Okay. So I'll place the dimension there, and then I'll look over at what's actually going to print. Remember, this is what you're printing, okay? And the dimension values look really tall, okay? And what you would find out if you printed this out and measured this is that this dimension text will print out at 1/4 of an inch. Well, the dimensioning rule in your text is that your text height should be 1/8 of an inch, or 0.125. So it's going to print out twice as tall as it should. And the reason why is because it's getting scaled up just like everything else, because of the viewport. It's a 2:1 scale viewport, so it's also scaling the dimension values by 2. So instead of being 0.125 like it is over here, it's actually going to print out at 1/4 of an inch over here. So, all right, so you could also place dimensions in paper space, okay? So, and by the way, you always, if you place dimensions in paper space, you always need to scale your viewport and lock it before you start applying dimensions. Okay, so I'm going to apply dimension. I'm using the same command, DLI, and I'm going to place the dimension in paper space. Okay, just to show you what I'm talking about, that dimension that I just placed doesn't show up in model space. This is actually lying on top of the viewport. Okay, it's still associated with the object by the endpoints here, but because the dimension style text height was set at 0.125, and this is just lying on top of the viewport, this will actually print out at the correct height of 0.125, okay? Because that's what the text height is set out in the dimension scale, and it doesn't have to, it's not actually getting scaled up by the viewport because I'm placing the dimension on top of the viewport. So as far as printing it out, this dimension text height is correct. Another way that you can place dimensions is from paper space. You can actually double click inside the viewport and place the dimension here. So if I were to place the dimension here, okay, now I'm not placing it on paper space. This is not on top of the viewport. This actually shows up in model space, as you can see here. when I double click outside the viewport, by the way, the only dimension that I place that I can select is this one. The other two are in model space, okay? But just by applying the dimension through the floating viewport here, the dimension height is correct in model space, okay? You can see that if I could look at the text height is 0.125, and if I look at the text height over here, it's equal to the one that I placed in paper space, okay? And what happens is that if I click on this dimension and look at the properties, I can see that this something new under the fit column here. It scales the dimension, okay? Even though the text height still shows 0.125, it scaled the dimension overall, okay? So regardless of which dimension I choose here, the text height will be 0.125, okay? And I know this is super confusing. And there's one other way that you can place dimensions that I know of, and you can actually make the scale annotative, okay? So if I go to my dimension style and I modify it, if I go to the Fit tab and change it to an annotative scale, I can actually scale the dimension based on the viewport scale. Okay, and I'll show you this real quick, even though I don't use it. So I can place the dimension over here using the annotative scale. And again, this is not something I really want you to do, but I can change the annotative scale based on what I already know the viewport scale to be, which is 2:1. Okay. And so even though the dimension shows up at this height in model space, it compensates for the viewport scale and shows up in the correct height in paper space. So of these 4 ways I've shown you to apply dimensions, 3 of them will print out correctly. 1, 2, 3. All 3 of those will print out at the proper text height of 0.125. The only one that won't is the very first one. That is scaled up because of the viewport. So you always have to be aware of your viewport scale. Now, if my viewport scale would have been 1:1, everything, either way that I showed you to apply dimensions would have been successful. Okay. So, by the way to get into the dimension style manager, you can type DIMSTYLE and then enter, and you can go into the dimension style manager, or you can just press D and then enter and enter the dimension style manager that way. One last rule I want to share with you, and this is something that is in the dimension style manager. If you're working on a metric drawing and you have a decimal inch dimension that is less than 1, you want to suppress the leading 0 according to the rule in your book. This is the rules for dimension values in your dimensioning chapter in your text. If you are in a metric drawing, however, you do not want to suppress the leading 0. In other words, if your dimension was a 1/4 inch in decimal inches, I'm going to just type it here. Your dimension value would be 0.25. Okay, you wouldn't show it as 0.25 if you're in decimal inch. However, if you need the precision and you're working in a metric drawing and your value is less than 1, you do have the leading 0, so it would be 0.25. Okay, so again, when the decimal inch dimension is used on drawings, a 0 is not used before the decimal point of values less than 1 inch. However, when the metric dimension is less than 1 millimeter, a 0 precedes the decimal point. Okay, so just to let you know, and I wanted to share these dimensioning rules with you.